When my father stood up at my wedding reception, he said, "I never did a father-daughter dance with her because wheelchairs don't belong on dance floors." What did you just say? I sat at the head table in my wedding dress while my father Richard held the microphone and 200 guests stared at him in horror. My new husband Blake grabbed my hand under the table as my father continued his speech that had started sweet, but turned into something else entirely. I'm just being honest. All those father-daughter dances at school events, and I never participated because it would have looked ridiculous. He took a sip of whiskey from his glass. A grown man pushing a wheelchair in circles while other fathers actually danced with their daughters. My Aunt Catherine stood up from her table. "Richard, sit down right now." But he kept going like he was proud of himself. She wanted to do one so badly in high school. Kept asking me every year for the father-daughter Valentine's dance. He laughed like it was funny. Can you imagine? Me pushing her chair while everyone watched and felt sorry for us? That's when my mother finally grabbed for the microphone, but Dad pulled it away. "Diana, don't. Someone needs to say what everyone's thinking." He looked around the room. "We all know this wedding is different because of her situation. Blake's a saint for taking this on." Blake stood up furious. "Taking what on? Marrying the woman I love?" Dad laughed. "Come on, son. We all know you could have had anyone. Someone who could dance at their own wedding." He gestured at me in my wheelchair that had flowers woven through the wheels. "Instead, you're here with someone who can't even walk down the aisle properly." My maid of honor, Jess, grabbed the microphone from him. "You're disgusting. Absolutely disgusting." Dad tried to grab it back. "I'm her father. I have the right to speak at her wedding." That's when my younger sister Lauren walked up to him. "You have no rights here. You lost those when you refused to be a real father." She'd been 13 when I'd gotten into the car accident that paralyzed me, and she'd watched Dad distance himself ever since. "Remember when you told Mom that having a disabled daughter was embarrassing?" Mom started crying at her table. "I never said that." But Lauren pulled out her phone. "I have the text messages you sent Mom. Should I read them to everyone?" She didn't wait for permission. "Diana, I can't do another school event with everyone staring at us. It's humiliating." She scrolled. "Here's another one. Maybe she should do online school so I don't have to see the pity looks at pickup." The whole room was silent except for Mom's crying. Dad tried to defend himself. "That was right after the accident." I was adjusting. I finally spoke up. "The accident was 10 years ago, Dad. You've had a decade to adjust." He looked at me with this weird mix of anger and disgust. And I did adjust. I paid for everything. The medical bills, the chair, and the modifications to the house. Blake's father, Robert, stood up. "You want credit for doing the bare minimum as a parent?" He walked toward Dad. "My son told me how you tried to talk him out of proposing." Everyone gasped, and Blake squeezed my hand tighter. "You what?" Dad shrugged. "I was looking out for him, making sure he understood what he was signing up for." He looked at Blake. A lifetime of limitations. No hiking trips. No dancing. No normal life. That's when our friend Alex, who was also in a wheelchair, rolled up to the microphone. "I've been paralyzed for 15 years, and I've climbed mountains. Literally. With adaptive equipment." He looked at Dad with disgust. "You're just a coward who cares more about appearances than your daughter." Dad pointed at him. "You don't understand. You chose this life. I didn't choose to have a disabled daughter." The room erupted. People were yelling at him, and Mom ran out crying. But Grandpa Joe, my mom's father, walked up slowly with his cane. "Richard, I've held my tongue for 10 years. He stood right in front of Dad. "You're not a man. A real man would have danced with his daughter, wheelchair or not." He turned to me. "Sweetheart, I'm 85 years old, and I'll dance with you right now if you'll have me." Before I could answer, Dad laughed cruelly. "You can barely walk, Joe. It'll be pathetic." That's when Uncle Paul, my dad's own brother, stepped forward. "You know what, Richard? After tonight, you're not welcome at any family events." Dad's face changed. "What?" Uncle Paul nodded. "We took a family vote last month. Mom, me, Aunt Susan, everyone. You're out." Dad looked shocked. Paul's voice cut through the silence like glass breaking. His face stayed calm, but his words hit hard. "My grandmother called everyone together 3 weeks ago, right after the rehearsal dinner, when Richard said I shouldn't wear white because disabled brides look like they're playing dress up. Every single person on Dad's side of the family voted the same way. No more holidays with him. No more birthdays. No more Sunday dinners at Grandma's house." Richard opened his mouth, but Paul kept talking over him. "Christmas is at my house this year, and you're not invited. Thanksgiving at Mom's, and you won't be there. Her 80th birthday party in March, and your name isn't on the guest list." Richard's face went from pale to bright red in seconds. He lunged forward like he was going to grab Paul, but Blake and Robert moved faster. They stepped between them, and Blake's whole body went tight. Richard started yelling about betrayal and ambushes, and how everyone was ganging up on him for just being honest. Blake leaned in close enough that their faces almost touched. His voice came out quiet and deadly serious. "If you take one more step toward anyone here, I will personally make sure you regret it for the rest of your life." The whole room went silent. Even the catering staff froze with plates in their hands. I realized Blake had been holding back this whole time because of me. He'd been letting me handle it my way, but he was ready to destroy my father if needed. My hands shook as I grabbed my wheels and pushed myself forward. Blake stepped back immediately but stayed close enough that I could feel him there. I looked at Richard and my voice came out stronger than I expected. Stop making yourself the victim. I spent 10 years trying to be good enough for you. Perfect grades in high school, full scholarship to college, job at the marketing firm before I even graduated. I did everything right, and you still acted like I was something to be ashamed of. The room stayed quiet except for my voice, and I could see people crying at their tables. 10 years of trying to prove I was worth loving even though I couldn't walk anymore. 10 years of watching you flinch when people asked about me. 10 years of you finding excuses not to come to my work events or meet my friends because you didn't want to be seen with me. Richard's face twisted into something ugly. He said he provided for me and that should count for something. I laughed and it sounded bitter even to me. Paying for things is the bare minimum of being a parent. You don't get a medal for doing what you're supposed to do. Lauren walked up beside me and her voice shook with anger. Dad's idea of providing was paying for stuff while complaining about every single expense, making me feel guilty for needing a better wheelchair, sighing loudly when we had to modify the bathroom, acting like every accommodation was this huge burden he had to carry. She pulled out her phone again and scrolled through old messages. Her voice cracked as she read. I wish the accident had just killed her instead of leaving me with a disabled daughter to deal with. Mom made this horrible gasping sound and started crying harder. Several guests yelled out in shock and disgust. Richard's face went completely white. He tried to say he was just venting in a dark moment and everyone says things they don't mean when they're stressed. Grandpa Joe walked forward slowly with his cane tapping against the floor. He stopped right in front of Richard and looked at him like he was looking at a stranger. Real men don't wish their children dead. Not even in their darkest moments. Not even when things are hard. He turned slightly to look at Mom. I raised Diana to be stronger than this. I'm ashamed I didn't step in sooner when I saw how he treated our girl. Catherine stood up at her table and her voice rang out clear and strong. Diana's sisters and I have been planning this for months. We have an apartment ready for you, Diana. A lawyer on retainer. Money set aside. A support system waiting whenever you're ready to leave him. Richard spun around so fast he almost knocked over a chair. He stared at Mom with betrayal written all across his face. He demanded to know if she was really planning to leave him. Mom stood up slowly and wiped her face with shaking hands. I can't do this anymore, Richard. Watching you humiliate our daughter at her own wedding is the final straw. I'm done making excuses for you. I'm done asking her to understand your perspective. I'm done pretending this is normal. Richard tried to walk toward Mom, but Paul and Robert blocked him again. His voice cracked and he sounded desperate. How can you choose her over me after 28 years of marriage? Mom's voice came out steady even though tears ran down her face. I'm not choosing between you. I'm choosing to stop enabling your cruelty. There's a huge difference. She pressed her hand against her chest. I'm ashamed of every time I stayed silent. Every time I made excuses for your behavior. Every time I asked our daughter to be patient with you instead of demanding you be a better father. I failed her by protecting you and I won't do it anymore. Jess stood up and announced in a loud, clear voice that we were moving forward with the reception, and Richard needed to leave immediately. Richard refused and said it was his daughter's wedding and he had a right to be here. Alex rolled up next to me and looked at Richard with complete contempt. You lost the right to call yourself her father years ago. Biology doesn't make you a parent when you actively reject your child. Several other guests stood up from their tables and moved forward. They created this wall of people between Richard and the head table. I could see friends from college and Blake's cousins and people from work all standing together to protect me. Solveig appeared from somewhere with 2 security guards in dark suits. She told Richard in a professional voice that he needed to leave the premises now. Richard argued that he paid for half this wedding so nobody could kick him out. Blake pulled out his phone and held it up so everyone could see the screen. He showed the receipt proving he and his parents paid for everything, because Richard refused to contribute once he found out about the wheelchair-accessible venue modifications. Richard's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His last excuse crumbled right there in front of 200 witnesses. The security guards moved closer with their hands ready. Richard turned to me one last time with fake tears in his eyes. He said I was his little girl and he loved me despite my disability. He tried to rewrite 10 years of rejection right there in front of everyone who just heard the truth. I looked him straight in the face and my voice came out clear and firm. I'm not your little girl anymore. I'm a grown woman who you failed. Your version of love feels exactly like hatred. Lauren stepped up beside me again. Real love doesn't come with conditions about how your body works. Real love doesn't make you feel broken for existing. Mom crossed the room slowly while Richard stood there looking like someone just slapped him across the face. She stopped right in front of him, and her voice came out quiet but firm when she told him she'd pack his things and send them wherever he wanted. Richard's hand shot out and grabbed her arm hard enough that she made a small noise of pain. Catherine moved faster than I'd ever seen her move and yanked Mom away from him while Uncle Paul stepped between them and warned Richard not to touch her again. The security guards finally moved in, and each one took Richard by an arm. He tried to pull away from them and started protesting that this was his daughter's wedding and nobody could kick him out. His voice got louder as they walked him toward the exit, and he kept saying he had rights and everyone was overreacting. I watched the guards grip his arms tighter when he tried to twist away from them, and one of the guards told him he could leave on his own feet, or they'd carry him out. The path to the exit took Richard past all the guest tables, and I watched people's reactions as he got closer to them. My college roommate turned her entire chair around so her back faced him completely. Blake's cousin stood up and physically stepped in front of his wife like he was protecting her from Richard. Several other guests turned away and refused to look at him even when he tried to make eye contact. He called out to his mother, who sat at a table near the back with my grandmother's hands folded in her lap. She looked up when he said her name, but then shook her head slowly and looked back down at the table in front of her. The disappointment on her face was clear, even from where I sat at the head table. Uncle Paul followed behind the security guards to make sure Richard actually left the property and didn't try to come back in. The whole room stayed completely silent except for the sound of Richard's voice getting farther away as they moved him toward the doors. Then we heard the heavy exterior doors close with a loud thud, and everyone seemed to breathe out at the same time like they'd been holding it in. Grandpa Joe walked slowly back toward me, using his cane for support, and asked if his offer to dance still stood. I felt completely drained from everything that just happened, but I nodded because this was something I'd wanted since I was a little girl. Someone who wasn't ashamed to be seen with me. Someone who didn't think dancing with me would look ridiculous or pathetic. Blake came over and helped position my wheelchair on the dance floor, while Jess caught the DJ's attention and made a signal for him to play something slow and sweet. The opening notes of an old song started playing through the speakers, and Joe placed one hand on my shoulder while holding my hand with his other one. We moved together in a simple swaying motion that probably looked simple to everyone watching, but meant everything to me. His hand was warm on my shoulder, and I could feel him moving carefully to the music, while I moved my upper body in rhythm with him. Other guests started joining us on the dance floor after a minute or two. They surrounded me and Grandpa Joe with their presence and support. Blake's parents danced near us, and his mom smiled at me with tears in her eyes. Catherine danced with her husband, but kept looking over at Mom to make sure she was okay. Lauren rolled over and grabbed Alex's hand, and they danced together with both wheelchairs moving in rhythm with the music. I looked around at all these people dancing and realized that what Richard said would look ridiculous actually looked beautiful. He was wrong about everything. He was wrong about wheelchairs not belonging on dance floors, and wrong about people feeling sorry for us, and wrong about me being an embarrassment. The song ended and everyone applauded. The sound filled the whole room, and I knew they weren't just clapping for the dance, but for everything that happened tonight. Blake took over from Grandpa Joe and kneeled down beside my wheelchair. He asked if I was okay, and I told him I was better than okay. I told him I felt free, like I could finally breathe without the weight of my father's disappointment crushing me down. Blake kissed me and told me he was so proud of me for speaking up, and that he was honored to be my husband. I kissed him back and felt tears running down my face, but they were good tears this time. Mom approached me slowly and carefully like she was afraid I might tell her to go away. Her face was red and swollen from crying, and her makeup was completely ruined. She apologized for not protecting me sooner, and for all the times she chose keeping peace with Richard over defending me. I told her I was angry at her for enabling him for so long, but I also understood she was trapped in her own way. Mom said she wanted to do better and rebuild our relationship if I would let her. I agreed to try, but told her it would take time and she needed to follow through on actually leaving Richard this time. She nodded and promised she would, and Catherine came over and put her arm around Mom's shoulders. Solveig appeared at the front of the room and announced that dinner would be served shortly, and encouraged everyone to find their seats. The mood in the room shifted from the heavy confrontation to something more like cautious celebration. Guests started talking and laughing again as they moved back to their tables. Blake's mother came over and told me that their family was my family now, and they would support me however I needed. Robert added that they'd already discussed making their lake house fully accessible so we could visit anytime we wanted. That made me start crying again, and Blake's mom hugged me tight. Lauren sat down next to me and admitted she'd been saving those text messages for years, waiting for the right moment to use them. She said she felt so helpless watching Dad treat me badly when she was younger, but documenting everything was the only power she had back then. I thanked her for being brave enough to speak up today, and we held hands while the catering staff began serving dinner to all the tables. She squeezed my hand and told me she'd always have my back no matter what. During dinner, Alex rolled over to talk and shared that his own father rejected him after his accident too. He said it took years to accept that some parents can't handle disability, and it's not because of anything wrong with us, but because of their own limitations and fears. Hearing someone else's similar experience helped me feel less alone in what I went through with Richard. Alex offered to connect me with a support group for people dealing with family rejection related to disability, and I told him I'd really appreciate that. Jess stood up to give her maid of honor speech and completely abandoned whatever she originally planned to say. She talked about how I was the strongest person she knew, and not because I use a wheelchair, but because I survived 10 years of emotional abuse while still building a beautiful life for myself. She said Richard's cruelty said everything about him and nothing about me. Everyone raised their glasses and toasted to that, and I felt genuinely celebrated for the first time all day. The room filled with the sound of glasses clinking together and people saying cheers and congratulations. Uncle Paul pushed through the reception hall doors 20 minutes later and walked straight to our table. His face looked tired but satisfied, and he sat down in the empty chair next to Blake's father. He told us Richard made it to the parking lot before starting another scene, yelling at the valet about how his own family betrayed him, and nobody understood what he'd been through. Paul said the valet called venue security when Richard refused to leave the property, and they had to threaten police involvement before he finally got in his car and drove away. Blake's mother asked if Richard said anything else, and Paul nodded, explaining that Richard's mother, my grandmother, already called Paul during the drive home. She told Paul she's cutting Richard off financially until he gets real therapy and makes genuine amends, not just apologies designed to get back in everyone's good graces. I sat there listening to Paul describe Richard's meltdown, and realized I felt almost nothing about it. Something broke free inside me when I finally spoke my truth in front of everyone, like a weight I'd been carrying for 10 years suddenly lifted off my shoulders. Blake squeezed my hand under the table, and I looked around at all these people who actually loved me, not the conditional version Richard offered where I had to be less disabled or less visible to earn his affection. The catering staff cleared the dinner plates while guests chatted and laughed at their tables, and the whole atmosphere felt lighter now that Richard was gone. The DJ announced the first dance, and Blake stood up, offering me his hand with this huge smile on his face. We rolled out to the center of the dance floor while everyone clapped and cheered. The DJ played our song, something slow and romantic we'd picked together months ago, and Blake started dancing around my wheelchair in this beautiful way that included me completely. He spun and moved with the music, holding my hands and incorporating my chair into every movement like we were truly dancing together. Other couples joined us after a minute, filling the dance floor with movement and joy. I watched everyone dancing and laughing, saw the string lights twinkling overhead, and the flowers decorating every table, and realized this was what my wedding was supposed to be all along. Richard tried so hard to ruin it with his cruel speech, but he failed because everyone else refused to let his hatred win. Blake leaned down and kissed me while we danced, and I felt tears on my face, but they were happy tears this time. Diana moved onto the dance floor with Grandpa Joe, and they swayed together in the corner away from the crowd. I watched my mother crying again, but her face looked different now, more determined than defeated. Catherine stayed close to Diana all evening, sitting at her table during dinner, and now standing near the edge of the dance floor, clearly ready to support her sister. Lauren came up to me during a break between songs and told me Diana already texted the lawyer Catherine mentioned. She said Diana asked to meet first thing Monday morning to discuss filing for divorce, and Lauren showed me the text message on her phone as proof. I wanted to feel hopeful, but part of me worried Diana would change her mind once she got home and face the reality of actually leaving Richard. Lauren squeezed my shoulder and told me she'd make sure Diana followed through this time, that she'd already offered to let Diana stay at her apartment while the divorce got sorted out. Blake's college roommate stood up to give a speech, grabbing the microphone from the DJ booth. He started talking about how Blake wouldn't shut up about me before we even started dating, how Blake saw me at a coffee shop and came home talking about this amazing woman he'd just met. The roommate said Blake described everything about me, my laugh and my smile and the way I argued about politics with the barista, and then almost as an afterthought mentioned I used a wheelchair. He told the whole reception that Blake said the wheelchair was just a detail like having brown hair or being left-handed, something that was part of me but didn't define me. Several guests laughed at the funny stories about Blake's early crush, and some people cried at the sweetness of his devotion even before we'd gone on our first date. I looked at Blake sitting next to me and fell in love with him all over again, grateful that he saw me as a complete person from the very beginning. The reception started winding down around 10 o'clock, and guests came up to say goodbye. So many people apologized for not speaking up about Richard sooner, for staying silent during family gatherings when he made cruel comments, or was excluded me from activities. I told them I appreciated their support now, and that's what mattered most. Several of Blake's relatives pulled me aside quietly, and mentioned they had concerns about Richard from the beginning, but didn't want to interfere in family business. Blake's aunt said she noticed how Richard never looked at me during family dinners, how he'd talk about me like I wasn't in the room. His uncle admitted they discussed Richard's behavior at their own family gatherings, worried about how it affected me but unsure if they should say anything. I realized Richard's behavior was obvious to everyone except those of us trapped in the family system with him, too close to see clearly how bad things really were. Diana found me near the coat check and pulled me into a tight hug. She promised she was really going to leave Richard this time, that watching him try to destroy my wedding day made her see clearly what kind of man he is. I hugged her back but didn't say anything because I'd heard this promise before. Diana pulled away and looked me right in the eyes, telling me she knows I don't believe her but she means it this time. Lauren walked up with her car keys and told Diana they needed to go pack essentials while Richard was still wherever he went after leaving the venue. Catherine followed them toward the exit, telling Diana she'd help pack and that she already had the lawyer's number programmed into her phone. I watched my mother leave with my sister and aunt, feeling this complicated mix of hope and skepticism. I wanted to believe Diana would actually follow through, but I also knew she'd stayed with Richard for almost 30 years despite everything. Blake came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my shoulders, telling me we'd deal with whatever happened with Diana together. Blake and I stayed until the very end, not wanting to miss a single moment of our reclaimed celebration. The last few guests trickled out around 11, and we helped the catering staff gather up centerpieces and personal items from the tables. Solveig found us near the head table and told us she wanted to thank us for letting her be part of our special day. She said she's been coordinating weddings for 15 years and has never seen a family stand up to an abusive parent like ours did today. Jedediah added that most families stay silent or make excuses, but our family chose to protect and celebrate us instead. Solveig told me it was an honor to be part of our wedding, and I realized she was right about what happened. What could have been a complete disaster actually became this powerful moment of truth and liberation, where everyone finally stopped pretending Richard's behavior was acceptable. Blake thanked them both for handling the crisis so professionally, for keeping the reception running smoothly despite the chaos Richard created. Blake and I walked out to the parking lot where his car sat decorated with just married signs and tin cans tied to the bumper. Someone had written congratulations messages all over the windows in washable paint, and flowers were tucked under the windshield wipers. Blake helped me transfer from my wheelchair to the passenger seat and folded my chair into the back. We drove toward our hotel through empty streets, passing closed shops and dark houses. I felt exhausted but genuinely happy. Lighter than I'd felt in years, like I'd been carrying around this heavy secret about Richard, and finally got to set it down. Blake reached over and held my hand while he drove, telling me he was so glad I finally got to tell Richard the truth. He said our marriage was starting with honesty and real family support instead of pretending everything was fine. I agreed and added that I was excited to build our life together surrounded by people who loved us completely, exactly as we are. Blake pulled into the hotel parking lot and parked near the accessible entrance, and we sat there for a minute just holding hands and breathing, ready to start our new life together.